On the edge of the world, where maps ended and death began, one man led 27 souls into a white abyss, and brought every single one of them back. This is not a survival story, this is a legend. A tale carved into ice, written by storms, and remembered by the fearless. In 1914, Ernest Shackleton sailed toward Antarctica, seeking glory, conquest, and the last great prize of exploration. Instead, he met a nightmare. His ship was crushed. His men were stranded on drifting ice. No food, no shelter, no hope. For 2 years they battled starvation, madness, frostbite, and the coldest place on Earth. Yet not a single man died. How? What did Shackleton do that defied every law of nature, leadership, and human endurance? This is Shackleton's Antarctic survival. Like you've never heard it before. The dawn of the 20th century, the world believed there were no more frontiers left to conquer. The poles had been reached, the continents mapped, and the age of exploration was fading like the last embers of an old fire. But one man refused to accept it. Ernest Shackleton, Irish-born explorer, dreamer, and commander of impossible missions, believed that destiny still waited at the bottom of the world. He launched the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, a daring attempt to cross the entire continent of Antarctica on foot, through lands where no living creature, not even a polar bear, had ever walked. To the world it was madness. To his men it was glory. To Shackleton it was fate. But the frozen continent had other plans. Before they ever reached land, the Endurance, Shackleton's pride, was trapped in the pack ice. Trapped, then crushed. It groaned like a dying animal as walls of ice folded around it. Shackleton watched his dream snap in half and sink beneath the Antarctic Sea. Now stranded on drifting ice with 27 men, 3 lifeboats, and supplies meant for a different world, Shackleton faced the ultimate test. There would be no rescue ship, no radio contact, no civilization within 1,000 kilometers. Only storm winds, temperatures below -40°C, and the endless, roaring white void. And yet, under his command, the men did not break. They hunted seals. They built camps out of ice slabs. They sang songs as their toes blackened with frost. They rowed across death-filled waters. And Shackleton, he walked through hell and made the ice obey him. This is the legendary truth of the expedition that became the greatest survival story ever told. The Endurance sliced through the cold Atlantic waters like a spear of polished oak, her black hull gleaming beneath the pale sun. She was no ordinary ship. Shackleton had selected her himself. Reinforced with 3 layers of Norwegian pine, braced with oak ribs, and built to withstand the worst ice on Earth, she was crafted not just to sail, but to survive. Every plank whispered promise. Every bolt carried hope. The crew adored her. They brushed snow from her decks, polished her brass until it glowed, and whispered superstitions about her strength. She's a lucky ship, they said. No ice can crush a beauty like this. But Antarctica does not bow to beauty. As the Endurance pushed farther south, the ocean began to slow. Sheets of white drifted past like the floating bones of some primordial beast. Temperature dropped. The crew's breath fogged in the air. Seals barked from drifting ice floes. And then, one morning, the thing they all feared appeared on the horizon. A wall of ice, endless, unbroken. The Weddell Sea had begun to freeze early that year. Shackleton stood at the bow, scanning the horizon. His jaw tensed. The ice was tightening sooner than he expected, closing the ocean like a giant fist. He ordered the engines full ahead, weaving through leads of dark water. The Endurance strained and shuddered, her bow cracking through younger sheets of ice. But each hour the lanes narrowed. Each night the temperature fell further. On January 18, 1915, the sea finally claimed them. The ice closed around the hull, gripping it with the slow inevitability of death. The ship groaned, long, deep, creaking sounds that echoed through the decks like distant thunder. The engines roared, but the Endurance did not move. The ice held her, locked in place. Shackleton stared at the white horizon. "We are frozen in," he said quietly. The men exchanged glances. They knew what those words meant. The ship was now at the mercy of the drifting pack ice, a prisoner of the polar world. For days they tried everything, chopping at the ice with picks, pushing with poles, firing up the engines. Nothing worked. The ice tightened. Crushed, pushed, squeezed. The hull bent, strained, cracked. Sometimes the entire ship trembled like a living creature in pain. The dogs sensed danger before the men did. They howled at night, ears flat, pacing restlessly across the deck. The temperature plunged to -30 degrees Celsius, then -40 degrees Celsius. Frost grew inside the cabins. Breath froze on beards. Kerosene lamps flickered weakly in the cold. Weeks turned into months. The Endurance drifted slowly, helplessly, across the Weddell Sea. Her wooden frame creaked constantly under pressure, but she held on. Shackleton kept morale high with humor, routine, and nightly gatherings. He knew despair was as deadly as frostbite. But in October, the ice delivered its killing blow. A pressure ridge rose beside the ship. 2 slabs of ice, each heavier than a cathedral, grinding together with a roar like the earth splitting open. The impact hit the hull. The ship shuddered violently. A beam snapped. Then another. Water sprayed into the lower decks. Shackleton rushed below. Freezing water poured through ruptures in the hull. Pumps jammed. The floorboards buckled. The ship was dying. He climbed back to the deck, face grim. "Abandoned ship," he said. The words cut through the air like a blade. The crew stood frozen, not from the cold, but from the realization that the Endurance, their home, their fortress, their last connection to civilization, was finished. They unloaded sledges, dogs, food crates, rifles, tents, and whatever supplies they could salvage onto the shifting ice. All the while, the ship groaned louder and louder, as if begging for mercy. On November 21st, as the sun dipped low, the Endurance gave a final cry, her stern rising, her bow sinking. Ice crushed her sides inward like breaking bones. Then, with a long sighing crack, she disappeared beneath the ice, swallowed whole by the Antarctic Sea. Silence followed. A silence so vast, so empty, that it seemed the entire continent stopped to watch the death of a ship. The men stood in the frozen twilight, staring at the grave of the Endurance. They were now alone. 28 souls on drifting ice, thousands of kilometers from civilization, with no ship, no radio, and no way to call for help. Shackleton walked among his men, putting a hand on shoulders, speaking quietly, steadying fear before it grew. He said the words that would define the rest of the journey. "Ship and stores have gone, but our lives have not. We go home together. All of us." And that was the moment the legend of survival truly began. The frozen expanse stretched endlessly in every direction. Silent, deadly. Beneath them, the ice groaned like the bones of the earth, shifting, cracking, and threatening to swallow them whole. Shackleton's men, exhausted from the loss of the Endurance, moved with precision and grim determination, salvaging every crate, every tent, every ounce of food. They set up camp on the ice floe, their temporary refuge on a continent that seemed to breathe against them. The first night was the coldest they had ever experienced. Frost covered their eyelashes. Boots stiffened like wood. Even breathing felt like inhaling shards of glass. Yet Shackleton refused panic. He knew that survival in Antarctica was a battle of will as much as body. "We are alive," he reminded them, "and being alive is victory enough for tonight." The men built shelters with blocks of ice, insulated with canvas and salvaged wood. Fires burned weakly, struggling against wind gusts that howled like wolves. Dogs were tethered and fed scraps. They, too, had to endure the unforgiving frost. Every night, Shackleton walked among the men, inspecting each tent, each stove, each crate. Morale was fragile. A single harsh word or lapse could shatter it. Rations were carefully calculated. They ate what little they could: biscuits, pemmican, chocolate, and coffee. Every crumb was accounted for. Calories were precious. Frostbite was relentless. Fingers, toes, and noses began to show the first signs of the polar bite. Shackleton monitored everyone closely, often sacrificing his own warmth or food to ensure a man next to him survived. But the true enemy was not hunger or cold alone. It was the ice. The floe beneath them shifted unpredictably, cracks forming like jagged scars across its surface. At night, the ice would groan, and sometimes sheets would break off, plunging men, dogs, and supplies into freezing water. Every step outside the tent was an act of courage. Every decision was life or death. Shackleton realized early that leadership here would be tested in ways no ordinary voyage could imagine. Discipline had to be absolute. Routine became ritual. Roll call, stove inspection, sled preparation, dog feeding. Every task reinforced purpose, reminded men of structure amid chaos, and warded off the creeping madness of isolation. He also kept spirits alive with storytelling, humor, and small competitions. A song here, a joke there, anything to remind the men that they were still human. Days blurred into weeks. They saw no sun. Clouds hung low like sheets of gray steel. Snowstorms buried tents and sledges, leaving men to dig themselves out, frost already creeping into exposed skin. Some men fell ill with scurvy. Others suffered hypothermia. But Shackleton's presence, constant, vigilant, unyielding, was a tether to sanity. He made the impossible clear. To survive they had to move, adapt, endure. It was during these weeks that Shackleton made the first of many impossible decisions. The floe they occupied was drifting slowly northward, away from their original goal. They could wait for rescue, or they could take the men across the treacherous ice to safer ground. Every choice carried risk. One misstep could mean death for all. He decided they would move. But first they had to prepare. Sledges were reinforced. Dogs trained to haul the heaviest loads. Ice picks, ropes, and food carefully distributed. Every man had a role. Every man knew the stakes. Antarctica had claimed the Endurance, but it would not claim them. Not yet. And so, in the white silence, under skies that never truly brightened, Shackleton and his men became something extraordinary. A tribe bound by desperation, courage, and the unshakable will to live. Here, on drifting ice, the legend of their survival was being forged. By April, Shackleton realized that the drifting ice could no longer sustain them. The floe beneath their feet was fragmenting, jagged cracks snaking through its surface like frozen rivers of doom. One false step, one unexpected calving, and men could fall into the icy abyss. The decision had been made. The crew would abandon the ice and take to the lifeboats, navigating the storm-tossed southern ocean to reach the nearest land, Elephant Island. The journey required courage beyond comprehension. 3 small lifeboats, salvaged from the wrecked Endurance, were barely seaworthy. Each was packed with men, supplies, and a skeleton of hope. The waves, whipped by relentless Antarctic winds, threatened to crush them against floating ice or overturn the boats entirely. Shackleton took command of the lead boat, every muscle straining as he battled against waves taller than houses. Men clung to every rope, every plank, eyes wide with cold-induced fear. Frostbite gnawed at fingers and toes. Hypothermia lurked silently in every splash of freezing water. Rain, sleet, and snow blurred the horizon, turning the world into a monochrome of ice and shadow. Communication was difficult. Shouting over the roar of the sea risked drowning their voices completely. At night, the ocean became a dark, living predator. Waves crashed into the boats, filling them with icy water, and every man had to bail with bucket and hand, muscles screaming. Shackleton maintained his leadership with quiet authority, issuing calm orders, lifting men's spirits, and ensuring that panic never took hold. "Keep together," he shouted over the wind. "One mistake and we all perish." Supplies were minimal. Food had been rationed on the ice, and now each man subsisted on scraps. Biscuits softened by sea water, a little chocolate, a sip of condensed milk. Water from melting ice floes was collected painstakingly. Hunger gnawed like a wild animal, but exhaustion was even crueler. Some men could barely lift their arms. Yet Shackleton, whose own body had endured months of starvation and frostbite, never allowed despair to take root. Navigation was a test of genius and luck. Shackleton used a sextant through the thin breaks in the clouds, calculating the treacherous course to Elephant Island. Currents shifted unexpectedly, icebergs drifted in unpredictable paths, and the small boats were at the mercy of nature. Yet every adjustment, every calculation, brought them closer to survival. One morning, after days on open water, the silhouette of Elephant Island emerged through fog and mist, a jagged, desolate spire of rock rising from the Antarctic Sea. Relief was tempered by exhaustion. The landing was perilous. Shackleton guided the boats to a narrow, rocky cove where waves smashed violently against the cliffs. With precision, men leapt from boat to rock, hauling the fragile crafts ashore, bruised, numb, and soaked to the bone. The island was uninhabited and unforgiving. Strong winds swept across barren cliffs. Snow and ice covered every surface. Food was scarce, water frozen or contaminated. Yet they were alive. Against all odds, Shackleton had brought every man safely to land. His leadership, courage, and refusal to abandon a single soul had turned a probable massacre into the first miraculous step toward survival. Here on Elephant Island they would wait, trapped between the Antarctic Sea and the unyielding continent, living on minimal rations, tending frostbite and injuries, and enduring storms that tore at their shelters. Shackleton knew that rescue would not come easily. He would need to embark on the most audacious voyage in human history, a journey across 1,300 kilometers of open ocean to reach help and bring his men home. And so, in the heart of desolation, the legend continued. Shackleton's Antarctic survival was no longer a tale of a lost ship. It was a saga of human endurance, unshakable leadership, and the unyielding will to defy death itself. The ocean stretched endlessly, a frozen abyss of slate-gray waves that rose and fell like mountains of ice. Shackleton's 3 tiny lifeboats, James Caird, Dudley Docker, and Stancomb Wills, were battered relentlessly by the Southern Ocean. Every wave threatened to swallow them whole. The men, drenched to the bone, shivering with cold, and exhausted from the relentless rowing, clung to ropes, each breath a labor, each stroke a fight against despair. Shackleton commanded the James Caird, the smallest and most seaworthy of the boats, no longer than 22 feet. Inside were 6 of his strongest men, selected not by rank but by resilience, trust, and unyielding courage. The rest of the crew remained on Elephant Island, under the care of the remaining boats, enduring the harsh Antarctic winds and meager rations while Shackleton set out to seek rescue. The voyage would span 1,300 kilometers of open ocean, a journey through some of the most dangerous seas on Earth. The men had to navigate with only a sextant and chronometer, under skies that were rarely clear enough to take readings. Storms arrived without warning, waves crashing over the small boats, filling them with icy water, threatening to overturn them at any moment. Frost clung to their faces, hands, and clothing, forming thick ice that made movement torturous. Rations were meager. A few biscuits, hardtack soaked in seawater, and condensed milk. There was no opportunity for hunting or fishing. Hunger gnawed at their guts, but exhaustion was a heavier weight. Rowing became a ritual of survival, each man taking turns at the oars while others bailed water and tried to keep the boat on course. Sleep was nearly impossible. The cold and the waves allowed no mercy. Shackleton maintained a near-mythic level of composure. His men knew, even in the face of death, that he would not falter. Every command was precise. Every order given with calm authority. "Keep the heading, hold the oars steady," he would shout over the roar of the storm, his voice cutting through the wind like a blade. The men obeyed not out of fear, but out of trust and awe. Shackleton had become more than a leader. He had become a force of nature, as relentless as the sea itself. The nights were the worst. Darkness enveloped the tiny boats, with only the icy stars above for navigation. Waves crashed in total silence and then thundered in sudden bursts, smashing the men and their small craft. Shackleton used every ounce of his skill to read the clouds, the stars, and the ocean currents. Every sextant reading, every angle of the sun and horizon was critical. One miscalculation could lead them to drift into the open sea with no hope of reaching land. At times, the men were so exhausted that they could barely lift their heads. Frostbite crept over toes, fingers, and ears. Skin cracked, lips split. Every wave that crashed over them chilled their bones to the marrow. Yet they continued, each stroke of the oar a battle against nature itself. After 17 grueling days, Shackleton sighted land. The jagged, snow-covered peaks of South Georgia Island appeared on the horizon. Relief surged, but there was no time for celebration. The boat could not land on the wild, rocky coast directly. The surf was too violent. They rowed and navigated through narrow channels, guided by Shackleton's unmatched skill, timing each maneuver to avoid the breakers. Finally, with the oars splintered, hands raw, and bodies nearly frozen, Shackleton and his 6 men reached the southern shore of South Georgia. Exhausted beyond measure, they dragged the boat ashore, falling into the snow, gasping for breath. They were alive. Against all odds, against the fury of the Southern Ocean, they had survived. But their ordeal was far from over. The whaling stations on the northern coast of the island, where help could be found, lay 36 kilometers across the island's interior, through glaciers, mountains, and snowfields. No trail, no path, no maps. Shackleton, his men, and their resolve would have to fight the mountain glaciers, steep slopes, and freezing temperatures to save the men left behind on Elephant Island. This was no ordinary journey. This was a test of the human spirit, a testament to leadership, courage, and endurance. Shackleton's decision to risk himself and a handful of men to cross the unknown mountains of South Georgia is what transformed a survival story into a legend that still echoes across history. By the time they began the overland trek, Shackleton had become more than a captain. He had become a symbol, proof that no storm, no ice, and no ocean could break the will of a determined leader. Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean stood at the foot of South Georgia's jagged mountains, staring at an impossible white expanse of glaciers, cliffs, and snowfields. The whaling stations lay on the far side, perhaps 36 kilometers away, but no map, trail, or guide existed. Every step into the unknown was a fight against gravity, ice, and the biting Antarctic wind. Their clothing was soaked and freezing. Frost clung to eyelashes and beards. Feet wrapped in frayed socks and boots now frozen stiff cracked with every step. Hands were raw from gripping ice axes, sledges, and ropes. Hunger gnawed relentlessly. Each breath was a labor, forming clouds of vapor that froze instantly in the icy air. The terrain was brutal. Glaciers carved deep crevasses, some hidden under fragile snow bridges. A misstep meant falling dozens of meters into icy death. Crevasses yawned like the mouths of ancient monsters, ready to swallow the unwary. Shackleton led with absolute focus, probing each surface with his ice axe, testing the snow's stability before every step. Every man relied completely on the other. Storms battered them relentlessly. Winds reached hurricane force, tearing at clothing, whistling through the jagged ridges. Snow fell sideways, reducing visibility to zero. Night fell early, leaving only darkness to guide them, broken occasionally by the reflection of distant peaks in the moonlight. They slept only in short, forced intervals, on snow ledges or small rock outcroppings, never fully sheltered. Progress was agonizingly slow. At times it took hours to traverse only a few hundred meters. Crean, exhausted, collapsed into a snowdrift. Shackleton's voice cut through the storm. Calm, commanding, unyielding. "Move or perish," he said. Worsley and Crean dragged themselves up, shaking with cold, every muscle screaming, yet they followed. The men knew that failure was not an option. Not for themselves, not for the crew waiting on Elephant Island. Navigation was treacherous. The island's interior was a labyrinth of peaks, ridges, and hidden valleys. Worsley used the sextant whenever the clouds allowed, making calculations by brief glimpses of the sun. Shackleton read the land instinctively, sensing the natural channels, slopes, and ice flows. Every decision, every chosen route, was a dance between survival and the forces of nature that sought to destroy them. Food was nearly gone. They subsisted on small rations, withered biscuits, and a few scraps of chocolate. Energy reserves were depleted. Hunger burned as intensely as the wind bit their faces. Every step was agony. Frostbite threatened extremities. Yet Shackleton's resolve never faltered. He encouraged his men with quiet words, humor, and unwavering confidence, transforming fear into determination. After 36 grueling hours, without adequate rest, without proper nourishment, they crested the final ridge. Below lay the whaling station, lights twinkling faintly through the snowstorm like salvation itself. Shackleton's eyes, weary yet resolute, filled with tears of relief. He had crossed glaciers, ice fields, and jagged cliffs that no map had ever documented, with two men whose lives depended entirely on his leadership and skill. They stumbled into the station, frostbitten, starving, and nearly broken. The whalers were stunned by the sight. 3 men emerging from the frozen wilderness, speaking of comrades stranded hundreds of kilometers away, alive but in desperate need of rescue. Shackleton wasted no time. He immediately organized a plan to return and save every man on Elephant Island. His journey, already legendary, would soon become mythic. This crossing proved more than physical endurance. It proved something deeper. The absolute limits of human will could be tested and yet remain unbroken. Shackleton had defied the Antarctic itself. The story of his leadership, courage, and indomitable spirit became a blueprint for survival against impossible odds, inspiring generations to come. By the time the rescue boats departed, Shackleton had etched his name into history, not just as an explorer, but as a man whose determination could bend even the harshest forces of nature. Shackleton returned to the whaling station with no time to rest. His goal was clear: rescue every man stranded on Elephant Island, the 22 souls left behind in tents on an inhospitable, frozen spit of rock. The Southern Ocean was unforgiving. Storms lashed waves higher than houses, and icy winds cut through every layer of clothing. Yet Shackleton's determination was ironclad. Failure was not an option. The whalers prepared the ship Yelcho, a small Chilean vessel barely fit for Antarctic conditions. Shackleton oversaw every detail: navigation routes, timing of tides, storage of supplies, and loading of crew. He would not gamble with the lives of his men. With a skeleton crew and the supplies he deemed essential, he set out on the perilous journey, the wind and waves immediately testing their courage. Days passed, and the journey became a battle of endurance. The ocean was a living adversary, tossing the Yelcho as if it were a toy. Icebergs loomed, some half submerged, like the teeth of some enormous sea creature. Visibility was near zero, the sky a constant sheet of gray. Shackleton's keen sense of navigation, honed during the journey to South Georgia, was now their lifeline. Each decision, each maneuver could mean life or death. Finally, on August 30, 1916, after multiple attempts thwarted by storms, Shackleton reached Elephant Island. Relief and disbelief swept over the men left behind. They had survived for months on scraps, enduring frostbite, hunger, and despair. And here was Shackleton, alive, commanding, relentless, standing on the ice as if the gods themselves had sent him. The reunion was silent at first. Men stared at each other, recognizing faces almost unrecognizable after months of deprivation. Shackleton spoke only a few words. Calm, authoritative, reassuring. "We are going home," he said. That simple declaration carried the weight of months of fear, the grief of loss, and the triumph of hope. The evacuation was meticulous. Every man was accounted for. Dogs, sledges, tents, and supplies were loaded with care. The journey back through the icy waters demanded precision. One wrong move, and the boats could capsize or freeze in place. Shackleton directed each maneuver personally, ensuring that morale stayed high, that every man moved with purpose, and that no one was left behind. Storms threatened every hour of the voyage. Waves crashed over decks, freezing the men instantly. Ice clung to every surface. Hypothermia and exhaustion gnawed at the crew. Yet through it all, Shackleton's presence was magnetic. His calm, unwavering authority inspired obedience and courage. Where despair could have taken root, he planted determination. After 5 grueling days, the Yelcho returned to the whaling station, then to Punta Arenas, carrying all 22 men alive. Not a single life was lost. Against impossible odds, Shackleton had completed a rescue that would be remembered as one of the greatest feats of leadership and survival in human history. Every man had survived storms, ice, hunger, and fear because one man refused to accept death as a choice. The story of Shackleton and the Endurance expedition became legend. Newspapers across the world celebrated his courage, his meticulous leadership, and his humanity. Scholars analyzed the feat of navigation, psychologists studied his command, and explorers everywhere marveled at the endurance of his men. Yet it was not simply a tale of adventure. It was a blueprint of survival, illustrating that leadership, courage, and unbreakable will could bend even the harshest forces of nature. Years later, Shackleton's men spoke of him not merely as a captain, but as a force who had walked alongside them through death and emerged triumphant. "He brought us back," they would say. "All of us. Every single man." And so the legend endured. Not of the ship lost to the ice, not of the frozen oceans, but of the man who refused to fail, who led with courage, foresight, and humanity. Ernest Shackleton's Antarctic survival was more than a journey. It was a testament that even in the most merciless frozen hells of the world, human will could prevail, unbroken, unstoppable, and eternal.